You've played every Mario game. You've conquered every Mario game. You think you've mastered all there is to know about Mario. Well, you better think again. New Super Mario World, made possible by the power of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. You've never faced the challenge of so many enemies, so many obstacles, so many levels. You've never needed help from a dinosaur before. Super Mario World, you get it only with a Super NES. It's part of the growing lineup of games for the next generation from Nintendo. You've got to play it. You've got to have it. You've got a reputation. Now you're playing with power. Superpower.
Welcome to the Enthusiast Gaming Podcast, where today we're going to be discussing the SNES. Some would call it the greatest system of all time. Some would not. But we got a special guest with us today, Brian from our blog team. He writes about Nintendo, exclusively Nintendo retro stuff, right? That's pretty much what you're covering over there?
That is definitely my focus, yep.
So we had to bring him on for this, right? We're talking SNES. I mean, this is right in his wheelhouse. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today, man.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. Super Nintendo, not my favorite console of all time, but it definitely ranks up there.
All right. And Wes, we know you were a Sega Genesis boy, but you're here anyway. We love you.
I got some love. I got some love for Super Nintendo too.
Yeah, so do I. I was a Genesis kid also, so this would be an interesting conversation to have. That's what we had to have, Brian. It was a necessity. It was a necessity
to balance things out, right?
Yes. Absolutely. All right, guys. So we're going to be discussing today our early experiences. We're going to talk about some exclusive games, our favorite games, SNES versus Genesis. So we're going to talk about the different versions of games that came out for both systems. We're going to talk about the marketing of SNES versus Genesis, some accessories and add-ons, and we're going to wrap things up with a pulse check, as we always do. If you don't know what a pulse check is, we just talk about 3 retro games, take a look at their prices, and discuss those with you together. Really quick before we get started, guys, I just wanted to shout out our sponsor, Puzzle Shopping. You guys can download the app if you look up Puzzle Shopping on the App Store for iPhones. I think it's on Androids as well. But Puzzle Shopping is basically an app where you can shop, but you get the different perks and stuff. There's discounts they have, and it's also like a social media app. So it's like social media / shopping where you can show off like stuff that you bought. Pretty cool. It's different. It's unique. Wes, you've checked it out a couple times, right?
I have. It's pretty cool. You can definitely get some good deals on there.
So Puzzle Shopping, you can go to puzzleshopping.com or download the app if you look for Puzzle Shopping in the store. Guys, don't forget to follow us over on social media at Nerdthusiast on all things there. Brian also helps us out with all of our social media stuff. So again, thank you, Brian.
I do what I can.
And you guys should be making sure you like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If you want to support us non-financially, if you just give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, that really helps us out. And if you like what you hear today and you want to support us financially, patreon.com/nerdthusiast is the best way to do that. You can support us for as little as $1 a month. This month, we're going to give a shout out to Bernardo. Thank you so much for your support, Bernardo. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Bernardo.
All right, guys, enough of the intro. It's time to get into it. Our early experiences with the SNES. Brian, you're a guest, sir. You get to go first.
Oh, my early experience was fairly early on. I wasn't there for launch day, but I did get it the birthday / Christmas of that same year. My birthday's in December, so my family always had a bad habit of just mushing those all together.
But, man, that's dirty.
It's the burden of being a Christmas kid. I mean, what can I say? But I was lucky enough to be able to get a Super Nintendo fairly close to the beginning of its lifespan. And I still remember to this day, my father installing it on our huge, I think it was like 24-inch TV. Gotta love CRTVs, man. And when we first turned it on, Super Mario World, of course, was the very first game that we played because it was the pack-in title. And my brother and I were just like, wow, look at those graphics. Like it was mind-boggling at the time.
Yeah, Super Mario was very impressive for sure. I think that might have been the first game I also played. I did not have a Super Nintendo growing up. I had a Sega Genesis, as I alluded to earlier, but my neighbor had an SNES, and he would play Genesis games in my house. I would play SNES at his house. Yeah, man, a lot of good stuff. I'll talk more about that in a little while. Wes, what about you, man? What was your first experience with the SNES?
As you kind of told everybody, I was a Genesis kid, so I didn't jump on at launch. it took me a minute. Uh, and what made me decide to go ahead and get a Super Nintendo was when they announced Street Fighter,
Okay.
and I was a big importer, so I wound up buying it with the expectation to order the import to play on it. So, and they had a couple arcade hits, because they had Final Fight, which was a big arcade game at the time.
Yeah, it
So
was.
Absolutely.
that was one of my launch titles that I remember playing for the Super Nintendo. So yeah, no, I loved it. Said Street Fighter made me buy it, and I enjoyed it. Wow, it was a great system.
So I have a follow-up question. So you bought it because of Street Fighter. So at that point, there was no intentions of that going to the Sega Genesis. I'm assuming that it was,
Correct.
okay. Which makes sense. They made like 17 versions on the Super Nintendo, so I'm sure.
It was only 3.
Only 3 of the same game. Interesting.
It was the DLC of the time.
It really was. It's like, hey, we updated something. Here's a new cartridge.
Right. Fork over $70.
$70.
Now, Wes, did you get the import? Did you achieve that goal?
I did. Oh, I bought the import. There was a game shop that sold imported games, and I ordered it, and I had to buy an adapter to play on it because the pins were a little different.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I got it, and I played it like crazy.
That's when you were in New York City, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, easier to get imports, if you're in a major city than, if you're in the middle of nowhere. That's going to definitely affect things for sure. If you were in Kansas trying to get an import, I'm sure there's a shop somewhere, but you're going to be hunting that shop down for sure. But now you
Yeah.
have the internet, so who cares anymore? It doesn't even matter anymore. It's like a joke.
Well, it's a
Yeah.
shame you didn't have the internet back then, because then you would have known that all you had to do is break the little tabs off inside of the Super
No.
Nintendo to play the Famicom game.
That was like no such thing. We had to buy the adapter. I bought the little adapter, but having Street Fighter almost a year ahead of time, it was worth it.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's definitely awesome. I mean, everybody played Street Fighter. That had to be like, if it wasn't the biggest game of my childhood, it certainly was one of them for sure. Everybody played Street Fighter. So let's talk about how the console was received when it was released. Brian, go ahead and take this part away, man.
Sure. When the Super Nintendo first came out, I mean, there was such a huge uproar from the parents, because you got to keep in mind that the NES came out right after the big crash in the 80s. So it was essentially like starting from scratch. It was one of the first consoles as far as all of these parents were concerned. And then when Nintendo announces they're coming out with a Super Nintendo, they thought they were getting ripped off. I spent all this money on this console, these controllers, these games, and now you want my kids to buy a brand new set of all this stuff? I'm not spending that kind of money. And so it was highly controversial at the time.
New Super Mario World, created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
That's the catch that may take many Nintendo maniacs by surprise. You have to buy a completely new hardware system to play the new Super Mario 4 game.
Why can't you just buy the cassette?
Because it doesn't play in the regular one. You have to buy the Super unit.
Who's doing that?
But the kids won, as they do.
Of course they do. And it's not like there wasn't a precedent. I'm sure we'll get into it more later, but there was already the Sega Genesis out on the market at the time. And so therefore there was 16-bit graphics. So I'm sure with enough kids complaining, hey, Johnny gets to play this game and that game, and they're so much better graphics than what I have on the Nintendo, that eventually it won people over. And the fact that Nintendo did pack-ins at the time, like I discussed earlier with the Super Mario World being packaged in the console, it was a game to play out of the box. It's not like parents had to worry about shelling out extra cash when they first bought it.
Because you remember when Nintendo had Mario 1, 2, and 3, which were huge hits. So when Nintendo showed a better looking Mario with more color, and he's bigger, and graphics were much nicer than what you were used to, it sold systems like crazy.
Oh,
It
it
really
really did.
had Yoshi. Come on, man.
I mean, yeah, and if people remember, Yoshi was supposed to be in the original Mario Brothers, so the fact that it was Mario coming out in its true form, the way that it was intended, it was a really big deal at the time.
Definitely. So let me ask you guys this question: it not being backwards compatible, did that like turn you off from the system? Were you not interested because of that?
Oh no, I was dead set on getting a Super Nintendo the moment that I saw any ads for it. When I read about it, Nintendo Power, when I saw the commercials, I was ready to get a Super Nintendo.
There's Dad over there.
Ooh, I just love all the new things Kmart has here.
Oh, I can see that.
So that's the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
What about it?
They say it has 16-bit technology, whatever that means.
Oh, I see. What else do they say?
That it has 3D graphics and digital stereo sound, and that Super Mario World is included.
Okay, we'll get it for him. So, how long did he work on you?
About 2 weeks.
Older me would kick younger me's butt for even thinking this, but at the time, I would have thrown my Nintendo just in the trash to get a Super Nintendo. Luckily, I didn't have to. My parents didn't make me do that, but oh my goodness, I would have confiscated, I would have forfeited all of my NES stuff if it meant I could get a Super Nintendo. Stupid,
I'm sure a
stupid
lot of
little
people
child.
did. A lot of people did,
Oh.
I'm sure.
Oh, sure. That was a trend, getting rid of your old console to get your new one.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the backwards compatibility thing, because it hadn't been a precedent yet. Other consoles weren't really doing it. I mean, technically Sega was, but the Master System wasn't big enough here that a converter didn't make much of a difference to people. But yeah,
Atari would have been doing it by then, though, right?
They would have, but again, the crash was almost like hitting a reset button. The fact that we had the crash, everyone looked at the Atari and the Coleco and the television as all that stuff as if it didn't even exist. And it's a shame, they shouldn't have, but I mean, that was just the mindset of our culture at the time.
Another thing we should note during this early period, this was a late start for them compared to the Sega Genesis. I think you know the dates, Brian. What year did the Genesis and the SNES come out?
The Genesis Genesis came out in 1989 in North America, and the Super Nintendo didn't come out until 91.
Yeah,
so
right.
you're looking at like a 2-year gap between the two. I don't know when NEC brought the Turbo Graphics over, but that was also before the Super Nintendo came out. Because over in Japan, the NEC, the PC Engine, was meant to compete with the NES. So the other consoles did have quite the head start on Nintendo. So the fact that at the end of that quote-unquote console war, the Super Nintendo ended up outselling the other consoles is actually pretty impressive considering how late it was to the game.
Yeah, especially Genesis. That's a 2-year head start is a big thing. But as we'll get into later, that first year or two was pretty slow until Sonic came out. That really changed the Genesis.
Yes. Yeah, that having that mascot really made the difference for them. But to your point, when the Super Nintendo came out, Sega Genesis had almost 100 titles out already. Mm-hmm. And here's Nintendo starting off with like 16. Like it was an uphill battle, but I mean they fought.
Yeah, I remember when the Super Nintendo launched. I mean the launch titles were like slim pickings.
Nintendo has a bad habit of starting off with slim pickings. If you remember, the Nintendo 64 only had the 2.
Oh, I remember. They only had the 2 for like 3 or 4 months. It was like desolate, man. I would go to the video store like every week. Like, is this it? Is this all we're getting? Like, is there nothing else?
Could you imagine the poor kid that got their Nintendo 64 and only had a Pilot Wing 64 to go with it?
That would be so dirty.
That was it.
At least I had Mario 64. I mean, like, I wasn't going to complain with that game. But, man, if someone gave me Pilot Wings in that and nothing else, I'd be so disappointed.
Which is funny because for the Super Nintendo, Pilot Wings was a revolutionary game. The fact that it utilized the Mode 7 that was in the Super Nintendo, that ability for it to scale all the background graphics, it was the first authentic simulator that we really had on a home console. So it was a pretty big deal.
I was going to say at least Sega with their surprise Saturn launch had more titles. At least they had 5.
That is right. That's so horrible.
Yeah, completely not prepared, and they had 5 compared to 2. Wild.